organizers, Olga, Courtney, PAIO, and also STU. So my name is Jingjing. My presentation today is about from self-attention to self-empathy, the investigation of Xuanzang's account of self-consciousness. So after taking a look at this title, your first question might be, who is this guy I'm talking about, right? Xuanzang. So basically, he was a Chinese monk who lived in the 600s Common Era. He conducted a pilgrimage from China to India at that time in order to study Yogacara Buddhism. So returning China, he translated a lot of sutra in Sanskrit to Chinese, and he was also considered as the founder of the Faxiang school, which is in Sanskrit Dharma Lakshana. So the Yogacara school of Buddhism is known for using the investigation of consciousness to reach the religious goal of realizing emptiness and compassion. According to Xuanzang, consciousness is liao bi, which means the transforming act of knowing liao, distinct objects bi. This definition soon opens up the possibility, in principle, of comparing Yogacara philosophy with Edmund Husserl's Phenomenology, because Husserl also defines consciousness through this relation of intending act with intended object, a relation which is commonly known as intentionality. My purpose in this presentation is not to merely juxtapose Yogacara with Husserl's Phenomenology or vice versa, so it's not a typical comparative approach. Nor do I attempt to synthesize them into a new theory, which is a synthetic approach. Rather, I intend to preserve a middle ground so as to initiate a dialogue between the Yogacarans and Husserl. Through this dialogue, I anticipate more than a list of similarities and differences. Instead, through the lens of Yogacara, we can see the latent possibility of phenomenology of religion that Husserl didn't develop in his lifetime. And through the lens of Husserl's phenomenology, we might be able to find a better way of interpreting Yogacara. So I consider my approach as a very Buddhist approach. What we can say is that the synthetic approach negates the comparative approach, right? So it negates a duality, somehow has a unity, but then this unity should be further negated to have a middle way, which is something Buddhists are claiming, right? It's always neither nor, but what is there in the middle. And this approach will advance our understanding, I hope, of the ultimate nature of human consciousness. Okay. So, now let's survey the status quo in the Yogacara scholarship. There are usually two typical understandings of Yogacara Buddhism. One of them we have already encountered yesterday. So some scholars reduce the Yogacara to a science of mind by disposing of ideality. Others simplify Yogacara as a nihilism that encouraged the devotee to renounce the world and encourage devotee not to engage themselves with everyday reality, right? That's a typical image of Buddhists as the world renouncer, right? But these interpretations, they are very misleading, not because they misrepresent the Buddhist worldview. More importantly, they overlook the fact that Buddhism is a religion in practice, not just a philosophical doctrine. For practicing Buddhists throughout history, their investigation of human consciousness or experience is subservient to the goal of realizing emptiness and compassion. This religious teleology determines that the understanding of Buddha's teaching inspires devotee to follow religious practice articulated by clerics. By examining the account of self-consciousness offered by Xuanzang and his disciple Huiji, I argue that later Yogacarans in China negates neither ideality nor reality. Rather, consciousness in its constant transformation opens up the possibility for subjective ideality to correlate with everyday reality moment by moment. This possibility is actualized by religious performances and moral actions. To help our understanding of this Yogacara worldview, I bring in Husserl's transcendental phenomenology. I argue that Husserl's phenomenology is a two-level approach to consciousness. Descriptively, it portrays mental activities. Explicatively, it explains the condition for the possibility of experience. That is, it yields a transcendental idealism. Yogacara's approach to consciousness, however, is three-level. Aside from the descriptive and the explicative, Yogacarans also establish norms for religious practice and moral action at the prescriptive level. So, every day when we open our eyes, we immediately have new experience of our surroundings, right? Such as today's weather or the trees in front of my apartment. Even if we close our eyes and fall into a sleep, we continue to experience other images, sometimes in our sleep. So consciousness becomes this realm where we get in touch with all kinds of objects. Some of those objects are psychophysically real, right? Like the tree outside this building, but some of them they are not, like the unicorn in my dream last night. So modern philosopher Edmund Husserl stresses the way in which consciousness correlates the mind, the body, and the world. He begins by pinpointing the defining feature of consciousness, namely intentionality. Here, I mainly pinpoint 4 phases through which Husserl develops his conception of intentionality. First, in logical investigation, Husserl describes intentionality as a defining feature of mental act that always aim at an object. So each mental act further consists of act quality, which defines what this kind of act is. Is it recollecting, percepting, or maybe like imagine? And also act matter, right? Act matter is something that could distinguish one recollecting from the other. So sometimes I recollect maybe my childhood, and sometimes I'm recollecting maybe the butterfly I encountered yesterday. So what differentiates those two acts that is qualified as recollecting is actually the matter. And later in Ideas 1, Husserl inaugurated his transcendental idealism. He devised this this method called epoche, and he continues to describe intentionality as a noesis-noema relation. Later in Cartesian meditation, he expands this twofold relation to a threefold schema, which is ego, congido, and cogitatum. And later in Kaido and Crisis, he expands his focus from the intentional I to the intentional we, which is something Husserl called the higher level of humanity. But then the question I want to pose here is this: why intentionality is so important? So ever since his early period, Husserl's investigation into consciousness is motivated by his pursuit of objective knowledge. So his question is, how can objectivity be ensured in subjective consciousness? This pursuit indicates Husserl's concern about the way in which naturalism distorted the conception of objectivity. So what is this conception of objectivity presupposed by naturalism? It's something like this: objectivity should never be interfered by subjectivity. So it's objectivity as something that is sui generis. So then, by juxtaposing subjectivity and objectivity as polar opposites, naturalism fortifies this mind-world dichotomy. There is, on the one hand, this mind-independent world, and on the other, psychical activities. When objectivity becomes irrelevant to subjectivity, how can humans meaningfully relate themselves to the world? This disconnection of humans to the world where they live every day immediately raises an existential crisis. To prevent us from falling back to naturalism, Husserl devises this reduction, which he called epoche. Before epoche, things exist in psychophysical natural order. Through epoche, natural existence of everything is suspended. And after epoche, the world becomes an intelligible phenomenon for the subject. So when we perceive those phenomena, our intuition reaches out to the world and makes this world an intelligible background. Through intuition, we open our subjective consciousness to the world. And through consciousness, though consciousness cannot determine those natural existence of those reality, it can determine not just the way in which something appears, but also the sense of which something appears. So basically, for Husserl, when a phenomenon appears in our consciousness, it has already carried at that moment a specific sense with it. So this correlation between subjectivity and objectivity becomes what Husserl calls this transcendental idealism. So that's for Husserl. Objectivity is secured by subjectivity, because without a subjective act, an object can never appear in our consciousness. By relinking subjectivity and objectivity, Husserl resolves the meaning crisis in Europe. Since naturalism is Husserl's prime concern, he really focuses on transcendental phenomenology in order to contest and challenge naturalism. He hence has not in his lifetime explicitly inquired into the possibility of phenomenology of religion, but he opens up the possibility, right? So later phenomenologists such as Edith Stein and Michel Henry elaborates this latent possibility by following Husserl's phenomenological approach. Here, before moving on, I want to restate this argument that I consider Husserl's transcendental phenomenology as the two-level approach to consciousness. So descriptively, it portrays mental activities through intentionality, and explicatively, I articulated those terms just for the stylistic beauty. Usually in English we use explanatory, but explicative somehow shows the parallel to descriptive, and later something I will say like a prescriptive. So explicatively it yields transcendental idealism. So for Husserl, the crisis of meaning is actually a modern product, right? Like that actually came with this rise of naturalism. However, for Buddhists, this crisis, as we have in suffering, is actually a birthmark of life. So this is very different. The conception of existential crisis for Buddhists actually indicates their religious fidelity to the Buddha's teaching. So faith plays a very important role here for all the Buddhists, not just the Yogacarans, but also all other Buddhists. Historically, the Buddha, or Siddhartha Gautama, this is a historical Buddha, sympathized himself with all beings in the cosmos. So he taught the way of overcoming suffering. Later Buddhist clergy inaugurated their respective approaches to elaborate. Like it's not just to interpret or to explain what the Buddha said, but also to develop, right, like further elaborate the Buddha's teaching. Yogacarans, for instance, employs the investigation of consciousness to demonstrate what causes suffering and how to overcome suffering. They then contend that this overcoming of suffering will further lead to the awakening of emptiness and compassion. Here I describe Yogacar's study of consciousness as a three-level approach. After describing how consciousness transforms itself, Yogacarans argues for how this transformation can give rise to the possibility of experiencing both attachments and awakening. To realize this awakening, Yogacarans further establish norms for religious practices and moral actions. These practices, sometimes, as we will later see, quite challenging for regular humans, not only demonstrate devotees' religious fidelity, but also reinforce their faith in Buddhism. So, at the descriptive level, Yogacarans offer full accounts to describe what we call today intentional consciousness. So the first one came from Shramati. So according to him, consciousness is Shramaviti, which means that it's the self-consciousness that constantly transforms itself. And then further, Nanda dichotomized the self-consciousness into the transforming act that produces its own object. So in Yogacara terminology, this transforming act is called the seeing part, the Dasharana Banga, and the transformed object is called the Nimitta Banga, the same part. And those two, they are called early Yogacarans. And later we have Dignaga, who was also mentioned yesterday. So for him, consciousness constantly flows as the underlying process, qua Shvasamviti Banga, which give rise to both the transforming act, Darsana, and the transformed object, Nimitta. And then Dignaga's disciple Dharmapala further thinks that all self-consciousness is immediately aware of itself. So Dharmapala supplemented a fourth part called justification of self-consciousness in order to further complement Dignaga's theory. So here we can see like how the Yogacaran's description of consciousness could diversify, complement, and also complicate Husserl's description of intentional consciousness. Aside from the description of internal consciousness, Yogacarans continue to describe 8 types of consciousness. So basically For Yogacarans, we have first 5 consciousness that pertains to our senses. They are momentary, they are not consistent. And then we have the mind, which is the 6th consciousness that is able to synthesize and then conceptualize all the sense data we have. But then if we take a look at the first 6 consciousness, we will see that all of them, they are momentary, right? Like they are not constant. They could stop from time to time. So the question is, how could them arise? So for Yogacarans, there should be further a 7th consciousness, which is called manas, or sometimes translated in English as self-identity. That is a foundation for the possibility of the functionality of the 6th consciousness. And then what will be the foundation for the first 5? So Yogacarans further assume that there should be the 8th consciousness, which is called alaya. So this term in Sanskrit, alaya, the literal meaning is storehouse. But storehouse of what? It's a storehouse of all the seeds, the bija. Here we can see like in ancient India, the terminology is actually quite metaphorical, right? So what is a seed? When we think about a seed, we know, okay, so we have a seed. But somehow this seed could continue to grow into something more, right? Like it could grow into a tree, into a flower. So what does this figurative term, seed, want to tell us? I propose to consider that as a possibility. So the seed is a possibility, and then this possibility, it can be actualized, right? Like we know sometimes the seed can grow into a tree, but it also cannot. It's also possible that the seed will just remain as it is, right? Like sometimes it will not be actualized. So seed is the possibility that can be actualized in events. And then what is the storehouse of all the seeds? So I propose to consider alaya as a condition for all the possibilities of experience. But then if we look at this statement, the condition for the possibility of, what is this? This is, in Western philosophy, we call a transcendental argument, right? So in Yogacara, there is this transcendental element. But somehow they don't use term transcendental. Sometimes we think that early Indian Buddhism, the terminology is really agricultural. So we have the seed, right? Like, and the seed could grow into the crops. And then we have, later we will see something more like watering, perfuming, and then we have storehouse. You can see like all of those imaginations, they are quite associated with agriculture. And that is also very different from our imagination today, right? Because we're no longer in an agricultural society. Okay. So in our everyday life, we have a very natural way of experiencing ourselves. So sometimes we express this feeling in language by altering propositions, such as, I am a coffee person, I don't like grocery shopping, I'm into cats, not dogs. Or we perform certain kind of action without keeping in mind the I proposition. This is always the case when I wake up every day at 7 o'clock, make my coffee, feed my cat, and go to work. We have inhabited in this kind of lifestyle so deep, so much that this implicit I narrative almost become oblivious. I am the maker of my life story, and this is how I obtain an immutable identity. For Buddhists, this view of how I obtain an immutable identity is a problem, because our view of this immutable sui generis I, or ego, is a svabhava, a self-nature, and also something that's very substantial. Once we condition ourselves to this svabhavic view of ego, we will naturally get attached to this fixed self-identity. Attachment subsequently leads to suffering. I suffer when I, a coffee person, cannot get my coffee in my workplace. I suffer when I, who hate grocery shopping, have to go to the supermarket. Or I suffer when I have to get up earlier at 5 o'clock, but usually I get up at 7 o'clock, right? The question Yogacarans intend to answer is why most of us presume our ego as substantial and as immutable, sui generis, and as svabhavic. This suffering does not always have to be a reflexive knowledge. More often than not, it can exist just as mental affliction. Xuanzang and Kuiji pinpoint 2 types of self-attachment in the city. Xuanzang translate them as bodily self-attachment, and discriminative self-attachment. So in our experience, according to Yogacara, the eighth consciousness, alaya, keeps turning itself into the subjective act of perceiving an object to be perceived. So in the case of bodily experience, this bodily experience is possible because alaya transforms itself into the live body as a subject, and then the corporate body as an object. Due to this constant transformation, Yogacarans compare alaya to waterfall or torrent. Again, very agricultural, right? Waterfall and torrent. However, this transformation of alaya has been falsely comprehended by the seventh and the sixth consciousness, which give rise to the bodily attachment. The sixth consciousness forcefully imagines subjective body as a stable identity. Likewise, the sixth consciousness tends to conceptualize the objective body into another permanent identity. After conceptualize alaya's transformation as the stable self-identity, we become bodily attached to our ego. Our attachment further reinforces our conception of self-identity. So there is always this mutual relation, right? So we first falsely imagine alaya as self-identity, and through our experience, since we have similar experience, and then the self-identity is reinforced. I am the maker of my life story, right? We always say that. So I have to sustain this self-identity. From bodily self-attachment, the second self-attachment derives. After securing the immutable I in bodily experience, each individual continues to develop other ways of identifying herself. This means fall under various criteria such as culture, right? That's how we use to differentiate someone from others, social class, or even the taste of fashion. Unlike Yogacarans, Xuanzang and early Yogacarans, Xuanzang does not ascribe the cause of attachment to the transformation per se. All the consciousness constantly transform. This is how consciousness are. What eventually leads to the Shrabavic view of the I is the misunderstanding of this transformation. As previously mentioned, the sixth and seventh consciousness, both of which are capable of conceptualizing, falsely imagine alaya to be fixed identity. This imagination further permits us of polarizing our ego with others. We keep reinforce our self-identity throughout interaction with others. And Xuanzang compared this constant reinforcement as perfuming and watering of the sea. Okay, so, but somehow, what is this transformation? So transformation per se does not give rise to attachment. It's a misunderstanding of transformation give rise to attachment. So here, transformation not only serves as a condition for the possibility of pollution, of attachment, but it also opens up the possibility of removing those attachments by purifying misunderstandings. So with regard to the way in which we can purify misunderstandings, Yogacarans establish norms for religious practices and moral actions. Devotees are supposed to practice meditation to grasp the right view of consciousness. So this is something that's quite conceptual, right? It's just the understanding, but there is something more. So after understand this, what should a devotee do? This right view consists in seeing things in experience as being transformed from consciousness, not as immutable entities. Once devotee realize that, okay, all things in experience are transformed, they will understand the interdependence between the self and others. This understanding will then evoke their compassion for all other sentient beings. So by conducting, and this compassion will propel them to conduct altruistic moral actions. And by doing those moral actions, devotee will reversely cultivate themselves and reinforce their realization of emptiness. So before moving on, let me explain what this experience of emptiness is. As Xuanzang records in the city, the transformation of consciousness is endless in time. If so, what is this experience of the ultimate consciousness as being empty? Is this so mystic that it cannot be expressed in language? Is it that ineffable? This question drives us to explore the metaphysical implication of the description of consciousness offered by Yogacaras like Xuanzang. A typical answer to those questions about what is emptiness is an answer like this. So emptiness is a void. It's nothingness. It's a void. Nothing exists. But this answer is very misleading because, as Xuanzang's disciple Kui Ji explains, emptiness is not a void. Why? Because emptiness actually consists of two meanings. First, we have empty. In Sanskrit, it's sunya. Empty is something that's very negative. It shows consciousness without any false imagination, without any fixed identity as the attaching and the attached. But then after having this negative account, there should also be an affirmative account, which is emptiness, or in Sanskrit, shunyata. But even in English, we can see this affix, ness, right? It has already shown something that's not so negative, not so empty, but something that's slightly positive and affirmative. So according to Kui Ji, emptiness is the nature of being empty. So this is actually the positive account. And this conception of emptiness is further elaborated by the three nature theory. So this three nature theory is not just descriptive, but also prescriptive. It just shows how this experience of emptiness is realized. So first, for regular people like us, like we are not the awakened ones, right? We are the ignorant ones. The nature of our consciousness is falsely imagining. This is how we usually conceptualize transformation of consciousness. And then after converting to Buddhism, the Yogacara thinks that devotees will realize this all-dependent nature, which shows that all the subjects and objects in our experience are not sui generis, but transformed from consciousness. And eventually, by conducting a lot of practice in endless time, later I will show how long those practices, the time can take. It's really, really long, more than we can imagine. The ultimate nature in which we will know, okay, things are interdependent and they are constantly changing. I have keep mentioning and talking about early Yogacara and the later Yogacara. So aside from their different description of intentional consciousness, their understanding of the three natures are also different. So as we were talking about earlier in the full accounts of intentional consciousness, right? We have first the Srimati and Nanda. So for Srimati, consciousness is just self-transforming. But for Nanda, consciousness is self-transforming that produces its own object, right? But if we think about those descriptions of consciousness, and then we cannot help but asking this question, so what is the existence of those transformed objects? If consciousness is just a transforming act, if consciousness is transforming act that produce its own objects, then objects, they're actually derivative, right? Like they originate from this transforming act. And then transformation produces this duality. And the early Yogacara will say, okay, because we have duality, then that's how we get attached to things. Because when there is duality, we start to distinguish between me and the others. And when there is this dichotomy between me and others, there is possibility to get attached, right? But then somehow here, this objects, they're transformed. Like, they're derivative. But somehow, they do not have existence. There is an analogy in Buddhism, like, those transformed objects, they're just dust. They should be swept so that the numinous mind could manifest itself. And if transformation leads to duality and then to attachment, and then this transformation is a false conception. So there is no duality, and the nature of all dependent, it has no existence. So for them, consciousness only in early Yogacara, it just means nothing exists but consciousness. So only consciousness exists. And what is this consciousness? It's actually something that's numinous. But if we think about this, somehow, if nothing exists but consciousness, then consciousness itself becomes sui generis, right? And somehow, for early Yogacara, this description of consciousness again becomes very Shravavik. But then later Yogacara, somehow they opt for another interpretation. So they think objects, they're transformed from consciousness. And we have the threefold relation, right? Or even for Dharmapala, we have the fourfold relation. And then we have consciousness as the continuum, the underlying flow, which transforms itself into both the act and the object. And then here, objects, they are not just derivative from a certain act. they all actually have their own way of existing. And the later Yogacarans, they describe this existence as seemingly real. It's momentary, but it's not non-existent. This is really important because it shows that, okay, duality does not lead to attachment. Duality opens the possibility of attachment, but what actually leads to attachment is our wrong view of those transformations. So for later Yogacarans, consciousness only means that everything depends on consciousness, but they don't think nothing exists but consciousness. And then for them, emptiness is actually the process of the process of awakening the pure mind. So here we see like transcendental idealism again emerge here. It's a view on reality, but also see the experience of emptiness is actually the process of awakening by doing a lot of actions. It's also a guideline for performances. Okay, so unlike Yogacarans, this is also important. Husserl does not concern himself with religious practice, right? At least not explicitly. After articulating transcendental idealism to secure objectivity in subjective mind, Husserl accomplished his project. But for Yogacarans, to demonstrate their fidelity to the Buddha's teaching, they continue to prescribe techniques for devotees to realize emptiness. And this realization is not just something in understanding, but also in practice. So this practice consists of 5 levels, and each level will last for several kappa. Kappa is a certain term in Sanskrit, and if we somehow translate that into modern English, it means like 4 billion years. Which means like, for every level we need so many years to realize the one level. And then our question would be, so what's the point, right? Like, it will take me 4 billion years, so I can't see it in my lifetime, so what's the point? The point is faith, right? Faith is important. For a lot of Buddhist devotees, they know they cannot see this realization in this life, but they kind of hope because of the idea of rebirth, right? Samsara. They know they will continue to do this through endless lifetime, and eventually they can realize this goal. Here, faith plays a very important role. The first level is accumulation. So at this time, a devotee converts to Buddhism, and she has a very strong determination to realize emptiness. But somehow at this time, because she only shows determination, so for her, self-attachment remains. But at this time, she starts to do a lot of moral actions and perform a lot of religious performances. So according to Yogacarans, they accumulate karmic grain, another very agricultural analogy, which means they are accumulating energy they can use for the next life, right? After rebirth, after getting reborn. And then after 1 kappa, 4 billion years, they will reach the second level of application. So at this time, because their faith is so deep, they will gradually conceptually understand what emptiness is, right? But this is just an understanding. It's not a way of life. So there will be further a 3rd level in which emptiness becomes the inhabited principle of living. And then at this time, each one will have the feeling that they live in the delightful purity. But in Mahayana Buddhism, self-realization of emptiness is important, but compassion is also equally important. So it's not enough just to realize emptiness for me, but also important to help all other sentient beings to reach emptiness. This is called the Bodhisattva's way. That's why there is a 4th level. It's the path of practice, or the level of practice. There will be more altruistic performances, which will help devotee to perfect their actions for others and to reinforce their realization of emptiness. And then eventually there is an ultimate level that will lead to the purification of the entire cosmos. This is very important because if we take a look at this, for Yogacarans, this the last level, it's actually an ideality to be realized by subjects in future, right? So it's not impossible. In modern Buddhism, this is described as humanistic Buddhism, which means that the Pure Land is not the realm we go to after death. The Pure Land is actually a place we need to realize through our actions. So let me just wrap this up. As I argued, Husserl's phenomenology is a two-level approach to consciousness, whereas Yogacara's approach is three-level. And then here comes the question, how come that there are two different ideas whose historical and cultural context are completely different and somehow eventually have a very similar worldview? I propose to give an answer like this. I think it would be too much to assume that, okay, Yogacarians anticipate Husserl's phenomenology, or to assume that Husserl is influenced by Yogacarians. I think that's too much to say so. So I propose to understand this common interest in consciousness in the following manner. So for both Yogacarians and Husserl, consciousness demonstrates the way in which humans are connected to the world. The ultimate nature of human consciousness is exactly this subjective-objective correlation. As Husserl argues, we ensure objectivity through subjectivity. Yogacarians further indicates that subjectivity gives us open possibilities. It can either secure or obstruct objectivity. Due to this open possibility, each subject needs to make an effort. That's the practice, right? Make an effort to realize their potential of seeing things as they are, or in Yogacara terminology, to realize the experience of emptiness and compassion. This stress of practice and performances thus constitutes one important dimension of the religiosity of Buddhism. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Two questions, and I'll ask the question first because I need to run and feed the Bija.
Yeah.
So, you know the term, have you heard the term Dagda Bija, the bird seed?
Yes.
So what would be your take on Dagda Bija in terms of possibility of experience? How do you interpret it philosophically? That's the first question. The second question is, in terms of Alaya Vijnana, that term, I think, stopped existing in the later versions of Buddhism. So what happened to Alaya Vijnana? And then the last question will be regarding Ashakya Marga. It seems that it also didn't make its way into later versions of Buddhism, because I had multiple conversations with Buddhist scholars on what happened to the existence and reality of the world, and what in Vedanta will be realization of Ishvara, because we realize Vedanta subjectively, and objectively there are lots of parallels, of course. So the Ishvara path, the realization of cosmic object, stopped playing much role, it seems.
Okay.
You can comment.
I think it's actually very interesting questions, and due to the limit of time, I am not able to elaborate all the accounts in Yogacara school of Buddhism. So first, for the theory of Bija, I think like the Chen Wei Shi is a very huge text, and there is one specific section that's about Bija. So let me just go back to early Yogacara and the later Yogacara. So for Bija, there are 3 accounts about Bija. So the first account is from Nanda. Nanda thinks that all the bija, like all the seeds, they can be polluted. So all the seeds, they can be polluted. And what does this mean is that what can pollute a seed is a term we encountered yesterday, karma. It could be my intention, my speech, or my action. So what does this mean? It means that, okay, consciousness itself at the very beginning, or like its original state, it is numinous. So it is already pure. But then how we have all the attachments, how we have all the sufferings, is because we keep doing different kind of actions, seeing a lot of things, and have different kind of weird ideas. So we polluted the seeds, and somehow that results in the suffering. And because of suffering, and then we again use suffering to pollute the seeds, so on and so forth. That's why we're so deep in samsara. That's the first account. The second account is actually that, no, all the bija, they are pure. They cannot be polluted. And what does that mean? That means that, okay, the 8th consciousness is a higher identity. It's a higher entity. So nothing can pollute it, nothing can change it, it's just there. And then the pollution actually happens in the seventh consciousness. The problem about those first two accounts is actually that both of them, they presume this idea of luminous mind. And this luminous mind somehow, it sounds very Shabbavic, right? Because it's a higher entity. And it's always pure, like always. This purity is immutable. And the luminous mind is sui generis. So again, it becomes very Shabbavic. So for Xuanzang and the Dharmapala, they kind of think that the seeds, there are some seeds that are always pure, and then some seeds that can be polluted. So that's the theory Xuanzang has. But what does that mean? That means that among the seeds, there are open possibilities, right? So because of the pure seeds that are always pure, there is possibility for us to purify consciousness. But then, because there are also the others that are polluted, it can result in and further reinforce self-attachment. So that's the theory of bija. And I think this is very good. I can answer like why the theory of Alaya Vijnana or even the whole Yogacara school somehow declined in China. There are two reasons. First, the early Yogacaras in China, Paramita and also Putiruchi, they have two schools, but then those two schools, they were absorbed in Huayan. And then Huayan influenced Chan, or in Japanese Zen. So that's how Yogacara declined and then being reinterpreted and absorbed in Chinese Buddhism. That's what happened for early Yogacara. What happened for later Yogacara is even sadder, because we can see this theory is very complicated. According to one historian, not just one, many historians, they kind of think that the Chinese are not very good at conceptualizing. They are very practical, so they just want something that can be in use immediately. So they were really not into logical thinking, conceptualizing. So eventually, they abandoned Yogacara Buddhism. So Yogacara Buddhism just declined, and after the great catastrophe of Buddhism in Mid-Tang Dynasty, which is about 800s, later Yogacara just declined. Absolutely, but all the texts, fortunately, were preserved in Japan because Xuanzang he had Japanese disciples, and Kuiji also had Japanese disciples. In modern China, early modern China, some clergy, they brought those texts back to China from Japan, and that led to a revival of later Yogacara in China. Why there is a revival? Because they think Yogacara can help the Chinese to compete with Western science.
I just want to make thank you so much for very much inspiring presentation. Could you go back to the 8th stage of the consciousness?
8th consciousness?
The alaya.
Yep.
Yeah. So up to the 8th, so up to the 7th, you use the consciousness, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the 8th consciousness is not really consciousness. It's a condition for all the possibility of experience.
Right.
And that distinction between experience and consciousness reminds me of the James and Husserl. James, the radical empiricism, emphasized that experience, pure experience, before subject and object, before the consciousness. So that kind of distinction somehow helped me to understand James and Husserl, she commented.
Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, one typical interpretation of Yogacara is that we will see, because most of them they use either Tibetan text or Sanskrit text, and we all know most of the Sanskrit texts, so they were actually recovered from Chinese or Tibetan language. But in the Tibetan tradition, the Yogacara preserved there is actually the one from Srimati, not the one from Dharmapala or Xuanzang. So in Tibetan Buddhism, the interpretation of Yogacara is really specific. It does not accommodate all the possible interpretations. And one typical, for me, I think it's very misleading interpretation of Yogacara is that, okay, the 8th consciousness is a higher entity. So it's some kind of absolute ideality which can exhaust all the reality. I think that's an interpretation given by scholars like Griffith. I think that's very misleading because that is almost to say, okay, Buddhists, they should renounce the world, yay. But somehow that's a bigger crisis for Buddhism in modern time because in early modern China, a lot of scholars consider Buddhism as a waste of social resources because they think Buddhists, they are not socially engaged. That's why we have this humanistic Buddhism now, which kind of says that no, Buddhism, they are socially engaged. Buddhists, they participate in everyday life and they can contribute to the society. And the dispute I have with those misinterpretations is really that if we just use Husserl as the lens to look at Yogacara, there is a Western centrism, right? But if we just use Yogacara as a lens to look at Husserl, then there might be a sinocentrism, which means like China is the center, right? I think what Buddhists they call the middle way is just to show that things they are interdependent, even though they are different. So it's not that we want to juxtapose two things as polar opposites, or we just want to combine everything into another, right? So if there is duality, we want to negate it. Maybe we need a negation of negation.
That's a good place to end, I think.
Yeah. Good. Yeah. Let me use a Zen analogy. So in Zen Buddhism, we say like first, it's also like the three nature, right? So in the first nature, we see mountain as mountain, water as water. And then after realizing, okay, things they are all transformed from consciousness, suddenly we feel like mountain is not mountain, water is not water. And after realizing the ultimate nature, again, we see mountain as mountain, water as water. So that's somehow parallel to my approach, right? Like to preserve a middle way does not mean a reductive or reductionist comparative approach. It could actually give us something more.
Can I share my belief as a Buddhist? I'm suffering. And I'm not suffering. From I'm suffering to I'm not suffering. The transition because I'm not suffering because I disappear. It's not a matter of suffering disappear. And then I as the world is suffering. So I need to change the world to stop suffering. That's my way of understanding what you
Right. Later, I hope I could do some more research to show the link between later Yogacara and the Chan or Zen, because in Chan, like Matsu or Baso, he actually say that everyday life is the way, right? So like to realize emptiness does not mean like in Hinduism we will just realize moksha and we become the unity with Brahman and that's it. Like everything just stops. Like in Buddhism, it's really like even if I realize emptiness, I still live in my life, right? Like I still have my body, I still have everything. It's just that how I experience my life becomes different. That's why Baso or Matsu says everyday life is the way. Like it's not that we just dissolve like in Matrix. No,
So we have to end here. Yeah, sorry.